Hi, my name is Aidan, and I'll be starting off with the first part of credit crunch mechanisms. So essentially, let's start off very simple with the Great Recession, our classic financial crisis in 2008 as an example, where it was quite easily the most severe economic crisis since the Great Depression caused by the collapse of the US subprime mortgage market. And even though this number varies a little bit, the stress on the financial sector transitions into the real economy, leading to over 30 million people without jobs. Now, how this works is that normally banks lend money to each other. It's called interbank lending. That regulates the system, and that's how it's been for the longest time. However, since one of the biggest banks, the Lehman Brothers, they failed, uh, everyone started getting a bit scared, and the interbank lending stopped because nobody knew who was going to fail next, and if they started lending to each other, that would increase the risk for themselves. And so, what we call this is risk aversion and liquidity hoarding. And so, yeah, banks were losing money. They were hesitant to give loans to businesses. That led to the volume of credit granted to large borrowers dropping by 47% during the fourth quarter of 2008 compared to the last quarter. This varies again, varies by country, varies by sector, but you can very clearly see that banks were very scared. And next up, we also have to talk about the borrower balance sheet channel, which essentially starts off like this. So we know that the net worth is the assets minus the liabilities, and if a person has a higher net worth, they pay reduced agency costs because they're less likely to default. And if you have a lower net worth, then you have to pay more. And so this financial crisis and its associated collapse in asset prices dropped net worths by 35%. And so what happens? This mechanism, this borrower balance sheet channel, amplified the already subprime mortgage slump into what we now know as a global economic collapse. And since firms couldn't get short-term credit to ship goods, well, that crashed international trade and essentially limited the development and thriving of firms and businesses, etc.
So my session focused on the two primary engines of the real economy, gross domestic product and the investment. Now look at this table, which shows 5 US recession using official data. You'll notice a historical pattern. In every major US recession, the decline in investment is exponentially more severe than decline in total GDP. This highlights that investment is the most volatile component of GDP. For example, in the oil shock, GDP fell by 3.1% and investment fell by 16.5%. But in 2008, the gap was even larger compared to other recessions, and this leads to our next part, excess capacity. Here is the mechanism. During the boom phase before the crisis, financial deregulation and easy money create optimism. Banks lend freely and investors build houses, office buildings, shopping malls far more than the economy can actually consume. This creates massive industry-wide excess capacity. So when the recession begins, when the bubble bursts, demand collapses, but the problem gets worse. Excess capacity leads to massive layoff, fall consumptions, and even more excess capacity, and further leads to profit falls, asset value drops, and collateral value drops, and this will trigger a credit crunch, which is fully explained in part 1. GDP contracts further and becomes a vicious downward spiral. To move on, let's connect excess capacity to investment collapse. To quantify this relationship, we can compare two physical asset bubbles. In 1990, the office vacancy rate was 33% above average, leading to a 9% investment crush. However, in 2008, the housing vacancy rate was 80% above the historical average, while the investment collapse and the subsequent GDP decline is much more severe too. It is clear that high excess capacity lead to a larger investment collapse and worse GDP decline. This pattern is not unique to the United States. It happens around the world. If we look at the 1997 Asian financial crisis, the ratio of investment to GDP tells a terrifying story. In Thailand, for every 1% drop in GDP, investment collapsed by over 5%. And we see this similar high ratio of volatility in Indonesia, South Korea, and even in Japan during the last decades. The pattern is consistent across countries and across time, so we can conclude that investment is the more volatile component of GDP. This brings us to a critical question. When GDP and investment falls this sharply, what happens to the people powering these industries? To answer that, I'll pass the time to the next part to discuss the unemployment dynamics triggered by this collapse.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shitan Le. My session focuses on unemployment dynamics. So, how financial crisis turn into unemployment? When a financial crisis begins, the first event is usually quite a shock. Banks becomes more cautious, lending falls, firms find it harder to borrow, and both investment and consumer demand weaken. As a result, they freeze hiring, delay expansion, and cut overtime or working hours. If the downturn continues, layoff becomes much more common, and unemployment increase becomes much more sharper. This is why the effects of financial crisis on employment are often persist rather than temporary. A clear example is the global financial crisis in the United States. During the Great Recession, U.S. unemployment rose from 4.8% in the late 2007 to a 9.9% 2 years later, reaching about 10% in the late 2009. Crucially, youth unemployment is hit faster and harder in the short run compared to the overall rate, because young workers are often last hired or hold the most temporary contracts. More generally, evident across the crisis show that unemployment tends to rise about 1 percentage point at its peak after a financial crisis. So why is recovering in jobs slower than recovery in GDP? One of the issue is mismatch after hiring freezes. Workers who loses job during the crisis may come from sectors that shrinks permanently, while new vacancies later may require a different skills. At the same time, employers often remain cautious and slow to hire during the recovery, which means unemployment can stay high even when the output begins to improve. So we also need to consider labor holding and wage rigidity. Labor holding means firms sometimes keeps worker to and reduce hours instead of firing them immediately, because dismissing and rehiring workers can be costly. Wage rigidity means wages do not adjust downward quickly enough to clear the labor market. So firms often respond through fewer hires and more layoff instead of wage cuts. So this also explains the difference between flexible and rigid labor market. In the more flexible system, unemployment tends to rise faster in the short run because the firms adjust more quickly through layoffs. In the more rigid systems, the immediate rise in unemployment may be smaller, but the negative effects can last longer and spread out over time. So unemployment shows us how crisis reaches ordinary workers. The next question is, where did deeper shock come from in the first place? To answer that, I will now pass the time to the next presenter, which will focus on financial crisis in housing and wealth effects. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Wonho Fan. I will now talk about the housing and wealth effects. Housing crash occurs when overvalued home prices become unsustainable. Driven by a combination of economic recessions and oversupply, a housing crash reduces household wealth, so family will spend less on consumptions, as housing is not just an asset market. It also supports construction jobs, household borrowing, and consumer confidence. Falling home values rise mortgage distress, which lower local demand. For example, in the Great Recession, the US government had about 6 million of foreclosures, and consumer spending plunged sharply as housing wealth declined. Regarding regional differences, I believe that housing shocks did not hit every region equally or at the same time. For example, some areas closer to the metro had a much greater price drop than others, since these housing markets were more overheated and supply constrained, so their decline were also more impactful. And by the end of the 2017, half of US zip codes still had not returned to pre-recession levels of housing prices, consumption, and employment. Recovery was slower when fixed-rate mortgages were common. Refinancing was even harder, which makes lender less capable of renegotiating loans. Last, I will talk about the real economic impact. The Great Recession showed how a housing collapse can also trigger a broader economic weakness. The US unemployment rate became more than doubled, from less than 5% to 10%. The Federal Reserve history source also demonstrated that home prices fell by over one-fifth from 2007 to 2011, which fueled for the crisis. In many regions, households remained cautious long after the recession officially ended. This explains why the recovery was unusually gradual.
Hi, I'm Tong Chun Yin. When the financial crisis hits, the real economic pain isn't just felt in banks or stock tickets, it's felt in the sudden silence of empty shopping malls and the stillness of cargo ships at anchor. Two forces drive this shift: a collapse in household spending and a breakdown in global trade. Household spending doesn't fall because people suddenly have less money. It falls because they fear they will. During the 2008 to 2009 global financial crisis, consumer confidence in the United States plummeted. By May 2008, the Consumer Confidence Index had already dropped to 57.2 from 62.8 just a month earlier. By the end of that year, as credit froze, that same index hit an all-time low. This psychological shock is critical. When confidence evaporates, so do purchases of cars, appliances, and homes. This drop in demand created a shock wave that traveled across oceans. The World Trade Organization reports that global merchandise trade volume did not just slow in 2009, it contracted by a staggering 12.2%. That is the steepest annual decline since World War II. Research from the International Monetary Fund highlights that trade fell far faster than overall economic output, largely due to the freezing of trade finance and the domino effects of broken supply chains. The pattern isn't unique to 2008. Look back at the 1997 Asian financial crisis. We can see the multiplier effects in action in Hong Kong. According to the HKMA's 1997 annual report, while private consumption grew over 7% for the full year, the crisis hit in the final quarter. In Q4 1997 alone, real retail sales fell by 4.8% year-on-year as confidence cracked, and this trade disruption proved contagious. An IMF study of the crisis found that the trade channel spread the shock across Asia remarkably fast. Effects were visible in neighboring economies within just 4 to 6 months. This is the dangerous feedback loop of the financial crisis. First, the credit crunch hits, then households cut spending and imports collapse. This import collapse is another country's export disaster. As trade volumes plunge, factories close, unemployment rises, and the cycle of fear and reduced consumption begins all over again. Thank you.
They now explain how economic recoveries can take different shapes, mainly V, U, and L, and why policy responses matter. The three recovery paths are V, U, and L. In a V shape, output falls sharply but returns quickly, often within a few years. A U shape means a longer period of weakness, while in an L shape, the crisis leaves lasting damage and the economy does not return quickly to its previous trend. A useful comparison is the Asian financial crisis in 1997 versus the global financial crisis in 2008. In several Asian economies, recovery was much faster and looked more V-shaped. For example, Korea moved from -6.7% growth in 1998 to plus 10.7% in 1999. This shows that even after a deep shock, some economies can rebound quickly under the right conditions. Research from the Asian Development Bank links this faster recovery to export orientation, accommodating fiscal and monetary policies, and favorable external demand. By contrast, after 2008, many economies showed more U or even L-shaped features because that overhang, weak investment, and excess capacity make the rebound much slower. Policy matters because it can reduce the depth and the duration of the downturn. Stimulus can help shorten a U-shaped recovery, but it cannot fully remove structural problems left behind by the crisis. In particular, bubble-driven growth before a crisis may not have been sustainable in the first place, so recovery does not simply mean returning to the old path. Recovery depends on the legacy of the bubble, including debt overhang, excess housing or capital stock, and balance sheet constraints. Importantly, even when growth resumes, long-term scarring may remain. Crisis can lower productivity, weaken investment, and reduce potential output for years. That is why some economies appear to recover in headline GDP terms, yet still suffer lasting structural damage. Overall, recovery patterns are not only driven by the crisis itself, but by policy choices and by how much permanent damage the crisis leaves behind.